The writers of 2004's The Batman had the unenviable task of being the first new Batman show since the fan favourite Batman the Animated Series. BTAS had defined who Batman and his rogues were for an entire generation, so it would have been easy to just repeat what they had done. However, they felt that there was no point in just doing the same thing again and decided to go their own way. This led to their acrobatic, more playful Joker, Batman's best friend becoming Clayface, and the sinister goth Riddler. However, I'd argue that the toughest BTAS act to follow was Mr Freeze. The thing to remember about this character is that before BTAS he was a generic cold-themed thief. He was a criminal that had accidentally doused himself in cryogenic chemicals that meant he could no longer survive outside of sub-zero temperatures. Hence his original supervillain name, Mr. Zero. But then in the 1960s, the Batman TV show brought the character to the small screen and renamed him Mr. Freeze, mostly because it sounded more menacing than the diminutive Zero. This version of Freeze prevailed in the comics for almost 30 years. Sure, his costume would change over the years, even going as far as aligning with the Superpowers action figure line, but his characterization was mostly unchanged. And then along came Paul Dini and his script for the BTAS episode Heart of Ice. Freeze's motivations were entirely transformed. Rather than wanting to steal out of greed, Freeze was instead motivated by revenge. Now, arguably, BTAS's Mr. Freeze is the most discussed character from that show, and Heart of Ice usually tops fans' best episodes lists. I talked about this in depth in my Mr. Freeze video, so if you want more details about him, add that video to your watch later list. I've linked to it in the info button in the top right corner. But the quick summary is that this reinvention added layers to the character, taking him from the Z-list to the A-list. This take on the character was so popular that DC incorporated him into the mainline comics. While his look continued to change over the years, at his core, he was still a broken-hearted man that just wanted his wife back. But for as beloved as he had become, there were only so many stories you could tell with him. He was only driven to villainy because of his wife Nora and her illness. Once she was out of the picture, why would he commit crimes? As we saw at the end of the direct-to-VHS movie Sub-Zero, once Nora was saved, Freeze wept with joy and walked off into the icy tundra, and yet people wanted to see more of him. In order to keep using him, the writers had to make drastic changes, as seen in the new Batman Adventures episode Cold Comfort. Freeze's new motivations became sharing his misery with others, after he was reduced to a head on mechanical spider legs. This wasn't the most popular move, but it did end up giving us the spectacular Batman Beyond episode Meltdown, so all's well that ends well. Having to compete with a beloved take on the character was just one of the problems that the writers of the Batman faced, and I think that ultimately they just decided not to compete. Rather than reinvent the character or repeat what BTAS had done, they decided to do the complete opposite. Instead, they looked back at the original comics and took their inspiration from them. There, Mr. Freeze is a cold-hearted, ice-themed thief with cryogenic powers. He can generate ice beams from his hands, which removes one of the comic book character's weaknesses. I mean, once he was disarmed, he was pretty much ineffective from that point. Similarly, the tragic origin was stripped away. Instead of being a scientist, he was a petty thief who fell into an experimental cryogenic tank while trying to escape Batman. In a freak accident, he was frozen and electrocuted at the same time, which transformed him forever. While Batman assumed he was dead, instead he underwent an irreversible transformation and became Mr. Freeze. Batman initially blamed himself for the accident, but soon came to the conclusion that Freeze was responsible for his own choices. This Freeze had a very striking design and retains the bold red eyes of the BTAS version, but his facial features are obscured by his icy helmet. This really dehumanizes him, making him look more like a demon than a man. Now, I have to admit, I don't like this version of Mr. Freeze. Gasp, shock, horror, who'd have thought it? I think he's actually pretty bland and a generic thief, but I get why they made the choices they did. The Batman was intended for a younger audience than BTAS, and they tended to shy away from emotional complexity, which made it all the more impactful when they did have more emotionally mature stories, I'd argue. And Freeze is a great example of that. All he wants to do is steal and be wealthy. There's no longing for a cure. If anything, he loved being a superpowered villain. Ultimately, this lack of depth meant that it was harder to tell impactful stories with him. As such, most of his appearances involved him either teaming up with other villains or competing against them. He formed a short-lived alliance with Firefly, clashed with the Penguin over sunken treasure, and was hired to help kill Superman. and even teamed up with a gaggle of heroes and villains to fight the Joining. And that's a recurring theme in his stories. He's very rarely the headline act. The Batman, whether rightly or wrongly, kept Batman at the front and centre of its episodes. The villains were mostly window dressing. I'd argue that outside of his first appearance, his most significant episode is Artifacts, a story set in 2 different time periods, although once again he is a plot device rather than an actual 3-dimensional character. Some 20 years from now, Gotham is under siege from Mr Freeze, and we see adult Robin, now Nightwing, and Batgirl, now Oracle, working alongside a more Dark Knight Returns-like Batman. He's jaded and grouchy with a big scar over his eye. He has clearly seen things and doesn't want anyone to get hurt except for himself. You can tell a lot about his change in attitude, not just from his darker costume, but his overall physique. He's massive. Everything about him screams, "Don't get near me." Freeze, now calling himself Freeze 2.0, has gone through a similar change. He has a much larger and more destructive suit, and has mechanical spider legs in an overt nod to the DCAU Mr Freeze, and plans to encase Gotham in ice for reasons. However, Freeze isn't really the main event of this episode. He's the thing that brings Batman and Nightwing together, yes, but the main crux of the episode is the breakdown of the Bat family and showing how jaded Batman has become in his old age. Despite this, Batman and Nightwing eventually defeat Freeze, injecting him with an anti-freeze formula. However, in the chaos, Freeze escaped. At his lab, he clambered into a cryogenic chamber where he planned to awaken the future in a world without Batman, which is exactly what happens. Freeze awakens 1,000 years in the future and resumes his campaign of terror, confident that without Batman, Gotham will fall. However, the authorities of the era excavate the Batcave, access Batman's computer, and recreate the anti-freeze formula. Freeze is defeated when the authorities use holograms to pose as Batman, much to Freeze's horror, and he is quickly defeated and placed in a special prison. I suppose it's kind of ironic that I argue that Artifacts is his greatest episode, when he is such a secondary figure in it. True, it's a story about the Bat family and the legend of Batman 1,000 years from now, but Freeze plays an important, if slightly underdeveloped role in the story. In many ways, this version of Mr Freeze reflects the Batman as a whole, a show that was willing to take risks, revisit old ideas, and reimagine familiar faces for a new audience. But in doing so, it left behind the emotional weight that made those characters endure in the first place. Freeze may look cooler than ever, but he leaves you a little cold. Still, it's pretty interesting to see how different creators try to reshape the same block of ice. Some chip away to reveal the tragedy beneath, others polish the surface until it gleams, and okay, I'm now done with the ice puns. The greatest irony about this version of Mr Freeze is that in trying to avoid the narrative traps of BTAS, namely relying too heavily on the tragedy of his wife, the Batman ended up falling into similar ones. There, Freeze has generic motivations. He wants to freeze Gotham and rule it. But there's no clear sense of how he plans to do that or why, and if he did succeed, what exactly would he do with the place? There's a photo in his origin episode showing Freeze with an unnamed woman, which could be a small silent suggestion of a lost love, but they never followed up on it. Maybe it would have been too sharp a turn in tone. Maybe the writers didn't want to touch the moral ambiguity of a villain who does terrible things for love. One thing I will say though is that this version of Freeze might be the most ruthless. People often assume Heart of Ice refers to Mr Freeze himself. But the real Heart of Ice in that story was Ferris Boyle, the cold corporate ghoul who created him. Freeze, in BTAS, felt. He mourned, he raged. His crimes were acts of grief. I've made several videos about BTAS's Mr Freeze, and I have at least 3 more planned before I move on. I can't say I feel the need to return to the Batman's Freeze after this video. He was loyal to no one. He wants money, power, maybe a frozen throne to sit on, but there's nothing deeper beneath the ice. He's a monster through and through. And whether that's better or worse, it's really just a matter of taste. But for me, he's a version I can appreciate, but not one that I enjoy. Okay, that's it for this week's essay. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really enjoyed the video and have the means, please consider making use of the thanks button to send a buck or two my way, because every little helps. I offer channel memberships for $1.99 a month. This will get you early access to my weekly video essay, priority responses to your comments, members only videos, custom emojis, and an icon on your profile indicating that you're one of my people. And special thanks to my channel members. Everyone who was a member at the time of this video's creation is listed on the screen right now. If you want to see your name amongst all these wonderful people, join the channel now. Next time, I'll be back on Friday to talk about another one and done Batman Beyond villain who didn't really want to hurt anyone, he just felt pressured to maintain his family's lifestyle after he lost his job. It's time to talk about Armory. And next Monday, I want to talk about a character that made a very unlikely appearance in Batman the Animated Series, the Old West bounty hunter Jonah Hex, and how he was a perfect foe for Ra's al Ghul. Hope to see you then.